what people are encountering is they're encountering this sense of sort of rootlessness, and there's a loneliness that comes along with that rootlessness. And when someone comes along and says, look, I've got a story to tell you, and if you fit yourself inside this, you're going to find meaning and purpose, people will give everything up for that story because it's incredibly powerful.
Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. There are scandals all over the church today. Leaders are falling, and in some circles, we have been following ideological ideas over Jesus. But there are countless people who are resisting this evil and are faithfully following Jesus. There are a few previous episodes that will help you as you think through what Mike says today in our conversation. So after listening to this episode, go back and listen to all of the Andrew Root episodes, starting with When the Church Stops Working. And listen to the episodes with J.R. Woodward as he talks about his book, The Scandal of Leadership. All of those episodes will help give you a broader explanation of what is going on here and really helps supplement this episode. So in our conversation today, we talk about some of the deepest challenges facing the church today. Our guest is Mike Cosper, author of the new book, The Church in Dark Times, and he's bringing this incredible framework from the philosopher Hannah Arendt to help us understand the dynamics at play. What Cosper lays out is how the church, much like the broader society, has become susceptible to the lure of ideology. These seductive stories that promise meaning and purpose, but ultimately lead us astray. He traces this back to the unbundling of identity that's happened in modernity, where we've lost those deep roots and sense of transcendence that used to anchor us. And the way Cosper unpacks Arendt's insights into the banality of evil is extremely helpful. The idea that the greatest horrors can emerge not just from some monstrous radical evil, but from this hollow, empty shell of a person, that's a profoundly unsettling concept with huge implications. But Cosper doesn't just diagnose the problem in this conversation. He also points us towards practices of solitude and thinking and storytelling and culture making that could help us resist these ideological forces and recover a more rooted, transcendent vision of what it means to be the church. It's a conversation that I think will really challenge and inspire anyone who cares about the future of Christianity in our time. So join us. So here is my conversation with Mike Cosper. Mike, welcome to Shifting Culture. Thank you so much for joining me. Really excited to have you on.
I am honored to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
I'm really excited to dive into your new book, The Church in Dark Times, Understanding and Resisting the Evil That Seduced the Evangelical Movement. You've been reckoning with this for a while, in the rise and fall of Mars Hill and such, but you've also experienced some of it. What has your personal experience been with some of the dysfunction of the evangelical church?
Yeah, so I grew up in the North American evangelical milieu. It's funny. I was just talking to somebody. I'm actually speaking in Houston next week, and I was laughing because I was like, I was actually baptized at Second Baptist of Houston in 1989, which is like, if people aren't familiar with it, like that's like mega church before mega church was mega church, And in fact, I was baptized by Ed Young Jr. And people don't know who that is, then they can Google it and they can find Pastor Fashion and all the wild, fun stuff around all that. But anyway, so in one sense, I was really kind of born into it. But I was also, the core of my story is that I was part of the church planting movement that emerged in the late 90s and early 2000s. And for 15 years served on the staff of a church that was right at the heart of all that. We started with 12 people in an apartment. When I left, we had 5 locations, almost 4,000 people. It was an incredible experience. a positive experience in many, many ways, but it was also a church that went through some really dark seasons of unhealth. And I left that experience reeling a bit. And so I've got a book that came out a while back called Land of My Sojourn that was about my own sort of journey in the wilderness with all of that. But then Land of My Sojourn is really, The Church in Dark Times is really about trying to understand not just sort of my story, but why does this keep happening? Like, what is the framework in which all of these churches are going through similar kinds of leadership crises?
So we do want to understand it. We want to know, why is this happening? I think you get the question all the time. And then what are we going to do about it? And how do we fix it? So you're taking the framework and the work of philosopher Hannah Arendt. And why is that work important for us to understand what is going on? And who is she for people who don't know?
I mean, you get me started on Arendt and I can go for a long time. Like, obviously I have a lot of affection for this woman who died long before I was born. Arendt was a German Jewish social theorist / philosopher. She was born in 1904 when the Nazis come to power in 1933. She's a student at Heidelberg. She's actually in 1930, like at the time, she's having an affair with Martin Heidegger, who's like the most influential philosopher of his generation. Heidegger becomes a Nazi. She's Jewish. That drives a bit of a wedge between the two of them. And then, she ends up getting arrested by the Gestapo because she is working on some resistance stuff. There's a fascinating story in terms of sort of how she gets out of jail in Nazi Germany. She essentially, we don't even totally know exactly what happened, but she essentially sort of talks her way out of prison because this poor son of a gun who was her keeper, ends up getting sort of talked out of letting her go. She goes home, she gets her mom, she flees to Switzerland, and then ultimately flees to France. While she's in France, the Nazis eventually come to France. They detain her there. She ends up in a camp in Gurs, and then she's part of a kind of a conspiracy in Gurs where they forge documents and they get out of this holding camp. And that's a really important part of the story because, number one, like, half the people who came to Gurs, roughly half the people who came to Gurs died in Gurs of dysentery and disease and typhus and everything else. It was a concentration camp by all but name. And then the other half of the people who didn't die of all that stuff, they were packed onto trains and sent to Auschwitz, and they died there. So it's somewhat miraculous that she escaped. So she forges documents, she gets out, she goes to England for a short time, then eventually comes to America, but the rest of her life here. And then this is where I think the story starts to intersect with what this project is ultimately about, which is she ends up spending the rest of her life going, how did the people I knew and loved become part of this system that was so damaging and destructive? She asks fascinating questions about sort of good and evil and the seduction of evil and the haunting of evil, publishes a book in 1950 about that. And then in 1961, she ends up covering the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the most infamous Nazis who was tried after the war. And that trial sort of upends her whole understanding of good and evil. And so ultimately this book is about sort of looking at, like, I'm not trying to say the problems in the church are the problems of Nazis. Like, I literally, like, there's like a author's note right at the beginning saying, I'm not saying this. But what I am saying is there's something to be learned from the way that the seduction of evil that was a big part of this story informs the way we understand the evil that I think has been a big part of the evangelical story for the last couple of decades.
And a lot of what you're walking through are different ideologies and what ideologies are and how we get caught up into them, the isms of our day and the stories that we tell ourselves that we can save the world, and that causes a lot of problems.
Right.
So then that begs the question, then what are these ideologies, and what are ideologies, and how is it different than a good story?
I think it's Alexander Solzhenitsyn who says that an ideology is a little story that can change the world. That's the whole sort of core of the idea. That's like you have this one idea, and if you were able to perfectly implement that one idea, it will logically, rationally, sort of unfold into all these other things and transform the world as a result. The Nazis are illustrative. They're not, doesn't mean everyone's a Nazi, but they're illustrative in the sense that what was so compelling for the average German was this story. And the story was the Reich belonged at the top of the food chain in the global order. But something was keeping them from their rightful place. And it was these Jews. And these Jews were living amongst them, and they refused to assimilate. And they had control of certain, banking issues and all these other different things. And so there was this subversive thing that was happening with the Jews that lived amongst them. And if you could solve the Jewish problem, you could liberate the Germans to take their rightful place in the world. Now, what's crazy about that story, and every time I talk about this, I find myself kind of bewildered by it. What's crazy about that story is that's the book of Esther, right? Like that's what Haman says to the king in the book of Esther, is he says, look, you've got these people living among you and they refuse to assimilate, and they've got these weird traditions and everything else. And if we can just kill them and take all their stuff, everything's going to be great. Well, that's what happens in Germany. And so Arendt is really trying to sort of understand how that works. But what Arendt does, and what makes her such a significant thinker, is Arendt was able to kind of quickly go to this sort of broader notion where she recognizes that, look, in a world where we've lost transcendence, where we've lost religious meaning, we've lost these deeper roots and everything else, this kind of story is going to have an incredible power. And so the Nazis obviously did this here, but Stalin basically does the same thing with this idea of the bourgeoisie, and this is what happens there. And then she goes on, if you read some of her other work, this collection of essays that she wrote called Between Past and Future, what she goes on to kind of talk about in there is she says, this is happening everywhere. Like this whole sort of mass culture thing where what comes along in modern society is you've got all these rootless, lonely people. And if you offer them a story that gives them some meaning and some purpose and everything else, they'll give everything away to devote themselves to it. And so what I'm trying to do in this book is say sort of yes and to everything Arendt says, and go, and in the church, we found all these little stories. You can find all these examples particularly inside kind of the church growth movement, where people said, hey, if we can just solve this problem, then we can reach the city, reach the world, change the world, et cetera, et cetera. With Mark Driscoll, it was reaching young men. With Bill Hybels, it was this challenge of leadership, and there's countless other examples.
So as I'm understanding, as these ideologies take place, there's the story that we're all buying into, and because we're rootless, we're uprooted. We don't have a rooted transcendence. We're not actually getting stuff from the transcendent one and living into this mystery and transcendence. We need to hold on to something, right? There's something that we need to make sense of the world because we're rootless. And these stories captivate us to move us in the direction. So how does, and you illustrate this very well, I think, in the book, that it's not just the leaders of these movements and these stories that actually play a big role, but everybody's complicit in it. How do other people and the followers become complicit in the wider story that they're trying to tell?
I think of it like this. I mean, this is I think a helpful way to illustrate it. Like once you've reached a point where you found a story that's provided meaning for your life. So let me back up a little bit. And forgive me if this is a little pedantic here, but I mean, it's a big part of the book. Like, if you were born 500 years ago, you're born into a family that's like, you live in this part of, like, let's just say you're born into Germany. You live in Bavaria, and your father's a baker, and you're a Catholic, and you're this, that, and the other. You're betrothed to the baker's daughter. Like, all these things kind of happen to you the moment you're born. And for experientially, when you're born into that, none of that's a question that you have to answer. Like, you're just given that. So Charles Taylor calls this bundled identity. Like, this just comes to you as kind of a thing. So then as the next 500 years come along, and you get like the Industrial Revolution and the miracles of transportation and all these great things that we love and enjoy in modernity. And listen, I'm a big fan of modernity. I love air conditioning. I love Wi-Fi, all that. But as all these things kind of come along, all of those identity elements kind of get unbundled in variety of ways. So now a person is born, and it's like, I have to figure out, what am I doing with my life? Where do I live? Who do I love? Like, not just who do I love, but like, do I love men or women? Like, there's all these questions that we suddenly have to answer. And there's a way to tell that story in a way that's all about sort of freedom and liberation, and how great it is that we're not shackled to things that are sort of handed down to us. But there's also a way to tell that story, and this is what I think Taylor does so well. There's also a way to tell that story that's all about how, like, man, this makes us really, really stinking anxious. Because all of a sudden I have big questions to answer about fundamentally who I am and everything else. Now, in the midst of that, while you're trying to figure out all of these identity and purpose questions, then you imagine that someone comes along in your life and they say, I have a wonderful story to tell you and a wonderful purpose for your life. And if you follow me, I'm going to send you on a trajectory where together we're going to change the world, and we're going to make it a much better place. That can be someone like a Mark Driscoll or a Bill Hybels. That can be somebody like a Stalin or a Hitler or a, whatever. And it can come in all kinds of different forms. But what people are encountering is they're encountering this sense of sort of rootlessness, and there's a loneliness that comes along with that rootlessness. And when someone comes along and says, look, I've got a story to tell you, and if you fit yourself inside this, you're going to find meaning and purpose, people will give everything up for that story because it's incredibly powerful.
It is. And I love, and I was going to read a quote from your book about this, about bundled identity and unbundled identity and rootlessness. It says, during that time where they had a bundled identity, Charles Taylor puts it, it would be virtually impossible for someone in this world to not believe in God. This results from a conscious choice between belief and unbelief, but from an intuitive feel of the world or cosmic imaginary shaped by the stories and practices they'd heard all their life. In this way, the world felt open to transcendence and mystery, and their imaginations had wings to explore it. These elements, roots and wings, fed into one another. From the roots came the stories, traditions that shaped a way of seeing the world and was open to transcendence. And from a winged imagination came the experiences that provided meaning and reinforced a person's connection with their rooting institutions. And so I think that's important. I think we're trying to get back to this place of transcendence that we're seeing this in psychology, that we actually see when we're actually open to receiving transcendence. That's when joy comes, and that's when flourishing actually happens. A right view of ourselves, that we're rooted. So we're seeing this in different ways, that this transcendence is coming back. We're like, hey, we're not rooted anymore. We need to get back to this rootedness. But the question then is, because ideology promises a feeling of rootedness, how can we tell the difference between an ideology and what is true and mystery and transcendent?
Yeah. So that is the question. I think it's such an important question. I'm glad you're asking it. I think the best place for us to go to try to answer that question is the book of Job. Because there's a remarkable contrast between kind of modernism, modernity, and ideology, and then what God does in the book of Job. And actually, like, if you really want to read something amazing, like, go read Chesterton's essay about the book of Job, because he's just phenomenal on this. Like, and again, like, I go into a lot of this in the course of the book, but like, what modernity did for us is it gave us this illusion that we could understand whatever we set our minds to, right? Like, Arendt says something about this in her book, The Human Condition. She says, that modernity gave us this sense, like, in modernity, the invention of the telescope gave us a sense that we could master everything that was large and massive and sort of beyond comprehension in one direction. And the microscope gave us a sense that we could master everything that went in the other direction, everything that was small and sort of outside of comprehension that way. So what ideology does is ideology gives you this story that says, here's the entire world, and then here's an idea that explains all of it. And if you just trace this idea out to its logical comprehension, you're going to end up at a place where you've either comprehended everything or there's sort of a utopian end result, that sort of thing. Contrast that with the book of Job, where God shows up in the book of Job and he's like, hey, look at the ostrich. Can you figure that out? Because you can't, right? Like, and that's the beauty of God's whole dialogue in the book of Job. Like, and I mean, I am so enamored with the book of Job. I could talk about this for a long time, but so throughout the book of Job, his friends are saying, you're a moral failure, and that's why these bad things have happened, and you should be more humble before God. And he is saying, I haven't done anything to deserve any of this. And when God shows up, God's going to explain all of it to me. So then God shows up and God says, I'm not explaining jack to you. You don't even understand a waterfall. You don't understand a windstorm. You can't comprehend an ostrich. So you should be humbled before me. The end result of God's dialogue with Job is that Job is satisfied. That's enough for him. Like, I'm going to be silent before the mystery of the world. And so on the one hand, I think, like, that's an insight into kind of the answer to the ideology question, because Job recognizes, like, there's not some simple explanation for all of this. Like, I'm not going to comprehend it. I thought there was. When God showed up, he wowed me with wonder and mystery, and I'm going to be silent before him. But there's another layer to it that I think is really, really important, which is that when God then reckons with Job's friends, he tells Job's friends, Job's righteous and you're not. And Job's friends, who had this simple explanation of, you must have done something to deserve this and you should be humble before God and all the rest of it, he doesn't call Job to make sacrifices to reconcile to himself. He calls Job's friends to do it, to reconcile with Job and with God. So it's like, the indictment of the book of Job is that Job's friends end up having to make these sacrifices and everything else to reconcile with God and Job. So there really is this thing of, like, man, there's just this massive landscape of sort of mystery, confusion. I'm going to overwhelm you with creatures and imagery and stories that just don't make sense. And if you can be content before that and go, okay, you're Job. But if the flip side of that is like the contrast to that is his friends who said there's a very simple, rational, moral structure to this whole creation. And clearly you brought this suffering upon yourself. They're the ones that have to make sacrifices and apologize. Anyway, that's a very long answer to your ideology question. But I do think it's like a fascinating deconstruction of ideology, because it's like the Bible just goes, no, we don't play that. Like, look at the ostrich and then shut up.
I love that. Let's do one more example, but let's do it from modern movies. And so let's go with the Barbie example and the movie Barbie. And how does that play into all this ideology? And I think your take on it was fascinating, because I think a lot of us think about Genesis 3. And so I really love what you said about Barbie. Ideology is Mattel, or saying that this Barbie can actually save the world, right? If we as the girls can be this or that, or whatever they want to be, and when they want to do that, this ideology says that this is the way that the world is saved. And then Barbie herself actually has the veil lifted and realized that this ideology is actually leading me down the wrong path. This isn't where it is, that there is a different world, and the world actually operates differently than this ideology has promised me.
Yeah, I mean, I found the movie fascinating, and I thought it was really well done. Because there really is this incredible contrast between there's sort of three layers, I feel like, to the story that film tells. One is it starts off with this sort of quasi-utopian vision of Barbie. And then, like, of course, like there's this sort of record scratch moment where she goes, do you all ever think about death? And like sort of everything sort of gets weird. And then, her arches collapse or whatever it is, that sort of disrupts all that. Then the second layer of it is she comes into our world, which is this very misogynistic environment. She really sort of struggles to find like a meaningful feminine identity, not even feminist, but like just she struggles to find a meaningful feminine identity once she comes to our world. And then she goes back to the other world and she's trying to kind of redeem it, which would, of course, by the time she gets back, Ken has taken over, and you've got this misogynistic, like, extreme happening there. Spoiler alert if you haven't seen the movie, but like the brilliance of that film is that last moment where she walks into, you don't know where she is. She walks into this room and she says, I'm here to see my gynecologist. And she's so excited because all of a sudden she's confronted with, like, I mean, literally the messiest elements of humanity, right? Like, which is what gynecologists deal with. And so, like, I love it as an example of kind of a counter-ideological thing, because what the viewer is left with, especially when it comes to women, and I can't remember, I should know this. I can't remember if the book actually goes here. I feel like the film really fails when it comes to men. Like, they don't know what to do with men at all. But what they succeed with women there is that the story ends in a way where it's got this moment of kind of interesting deconstruction where she's going, to be a woman is to live with the complexity of suffering and loss and the messiness of humanity and everything else. And it rejects all of the, like, it rejects the ideological sort of living in a Barbie world, I'm a Barbie girl in a Barbie world. And if I just lean into femininity, I get to achieve everything that I want. Actually, if you lean into your femininity, like, you're a woman who needs a gynecologist. And there's complexity to all of that.
Well, yeah, I think it's fascinating. I think it's helpful for us just to wrap our heads around what's going on and where ideology can go wrong and off. And I think one of the things that you work in and a lot is your chapter that Arendt went to the trial of Adolf Eichmann. I think that's really like her actually reckoning with who he is, when we thought that he was just the epitome of evil, and then realized that he doesn't have a thought that he can have by himself. He just is somebody that repeats everything that he's heard, doesn't have his own thoughts. What is she starting to reckon with? How did it start to upend what her previous work, and what was she realizing throughout that trial?
Yeah, so in 1950, she publishes the first edition of the Origins of Totalitarianism. And there's a section in the book where she kind of her conclusion about like what happened in Nazi Germany was she kind of concludes by drawing out this idea that came from Immanuel Kant, the famous philosopher, that what we saw in Nazi Germany was radical evil. It was something that was sort of unprecedented on the world stage and all of this. And so then you fast forward a decade, and the Mossad captures Eichmann. They kidnap him back to Israel. She goes and she covers the trial. And so Eichmann was like a senior SS official who was kind of ultimately responsible for like all of the logistics and scheduling and coordination of the final solution. And he had been presented, especially in, and again, like, just understand with Arendt was like a incredible student of all of the testimony of Nazis post World War II. So Eichmann had been presented as this monster that was this architect of the final solution. And so that's what she expects to encounter when she goes to Jerusalem, is this like horrific anti-Semitic monster. And people misunderstand a little bit about what exactly happens here, because there are some people, you'll find accounts where people say Arendt went to Jerusalem and she was kind of duped by Eichmann, by the personality that he displayed. The reality is that like she knew everything there was to know about this guy before she ever arrived there. She had read pages and pages and pages of transcripts of interviews with him, both from the Mossad and also from a journalist that was in Argentina that had interviewed him quite a bit before the trial ever began. And she had read all of these interviews. So she kind of knows exactly what she's dealing with. And she sees this guy, and he's in the booth at the trial, and there's all this drama going on around him. She's very critical of the trial. She feels like they've mismanaged the trial significantly, because they've kind of tried to turn this guy into a monster. And she's like, and then you look at him, and he talks in cliches, and he talks in stock phrases, and he spends as much time trying to kind of talk about the successes and advances of his own career as he does actually answering the questions of anything else. And what she sees in Eichmann, and I think she's right. I mean, what she sees in Eichmann is she sees this is this like careerist buffoon. And it just so happened that the opportunity that was set in front of him was to be an anti-Semite murderer of Jews in order to advance himself inside this institution. And so what emerges for her then is kind of this new theory of evil, where she goes, this isn't radical evil. This isn't some monstrous thing, transcendent concept of evil from beyond that's incomprehensible. It's empty. It's hollow. There's nothing there. This is a guy who's an empty shell who would say whatever it took for him to advance his career. And what I think is really important about her theory, and part of the reason why I think she's so right, is like you look at Christian tradition around evil, and over again it kind of comes back to this idea that like evil is emptiness. It's the absence of God. It's the absence of a moral vision. And so when she talks about the banality of evil as being this sort of emptiness, which ends up getting filled by this careerist buffoon who talks in stock phrases and everything else, it's like that makes a whole lot of sense when you understand Genesis 3 and beyond as a world in which it's not even that people are sort of actively motivated to like fly in the face of God. It's that they're actively motivated to prove their own value and worth in a world without God. It's about the emptiness itself. That's what makes her vision so compelling to me.
That was great. That was a great insight. Your last thing you just said was a fantastic insight. So I want to get into some of these things, what we could do to resist this evil coming into the church and how we should then counter this. What should we be doing? And one, Arendt talks after that trial about thinking and judging is one of the crucial things that we need to do. And you take it into solitude and thinking. I have a quote from Jamie Winship, what I really like. He says that no innovation can occur without contemplation first. Like we can't actually have a new thought or a new idea without contemplating. Like we actually have to sit back to have a good thought. So what is solitude and thinking, and how does that help us resist?
Yeah, there's a deep relationship between the two, because on the one hand, I would say that it's the cultivation of solitude and quiet, and it's the kind of shutting out of distractions that enables you to think. And then thinking is what enables you to sort of resist or deconstruct or question the ideologies that become so common in the world that we live in. The way Arendt defines thinking, that again I think it's just so interesting, is she says thinking is a dialogue between two people, me and myself. And so what it is and what's wild is like I mean, you know this, right? Like we live in this moment where we are so inundated with information and messaging and text messages and social media messages and the feeds and the emails and everything else. Like we're just constantly bombarded with stuff. So even just to get to a place in our lives where the only voices we hear are me and myself, that is a severe asceticism in a certain sense, right? And so what Arendt says is she says that solitude is the place that we escape to, where we can decide, what do I actually think about something? We shut out the noise and we have a conversation with ourselves where when we're ready to emerge on the other side of it, we go, hey, I've talked to myself about this and this is what I think. That's incredibly rare. Like when we actually think of the mechanics of that in the moment in which we live, it's an incredibly rare thing. So when we think about thinking and judging, like thinking and judging that's the product of that dialogue with ourselves. And what I try to sort of add to the equation, and I talk about this a bit in the book, is that for the Christian, there's, Arendt says there's never a conversation of one, it's always a conversation of me with myself. And what I say is, for the Christian, there's never a conversation with me with myself. It's me and myself and the person of God present in his Holy Spirit, who's alive and active and speaking with us in the midst of these things. That's so critical. It's so important. And to sort of pull the lens back a bit, it's like the Christian tradition is just rich with the idea that that's essential, that we withdraw to kind of hear from the voice of God and to have this, I think the Christian tradition tends to kind of lean into this idea of a sort of a two-way dialogue between us and God. I think Arendt is really helpful on this by saying, no, actually, it's actually a three-way dialogue. It's me, myself, and God, because I don't even know necessarily what I think about it, and I kind of need to talk to myself about it as I talk to God about it. If we want to be the kind of person that isn't susceptible to ideology, whether it's political ideology or these evangelical ideologies that kind of consume the church and absorb people in these ways and consume their lives in these different ways, it's really about having a kind of lifestyle and a practice that gives us a place to have that dialogue, that three-way dialogue.
Yeah, I think it's crucial. That dialogue is really crucial. I love that three-way dialogue conversation, that we actually have to figure out what we think, then we can bring it to God and have God interact with us. I think that can be really helpful, that we're not just going to parrot what other says and have this mimetic desire that that Girard talks about. Also, you give it a great example of a resistor in Eugene Peterson. I think probably his stories within Burning in My Bones by Wayne Collier, the biography of Eugene Peterson, has been probably the thing that my wife and I have gone to the most when talking about these problems in the church and what is happening. We're just going back to Eugene Peterson and his stories. How is Eugene Peterson a good example for us to walk in the ways of Jesus and to resist the evil of our time?
He was the kind of person who, I think if you look at his intellect, his ability to communicate and all the rest, you look at his generation and there's all these celebrity pastors of various sorts. He clearly could have become one of those people. He had the gift of communication. He had all, nothing was holding him back from becoming kind of a Jerry Falwell Sr. or Jim Baker or the book talks about his relationship with I can't, the name is escaping me right now, but the famous celebrity pastor that was, or televangelist that he was friends with in seminary. Like all those opportunities were there for him if he wanted to kind of tap into it. And he just consistently made decisions that said, I am going to choose the local, the small, the familial, the congregational over the opportunities for fame and fortune. And I think because of that, it's one of those things where a generation, 2 generations from now, people will know his name in a way that they don't know the name of a whole lot of celebrity pastors that were of his generation since then. He just really focused on caring for the local, caring for the souls, doing this, grinding work of making the message, some of which will be forgotten, but some of which is going to live well beyond you and me, and probably well beyond you and me and our kids,
Here, I'm just going to read page 177. You, in your storytelling and culture making chapter, is another practices that we could do is storytelling. You talk about Eugene Peterson once again. He says here again, we could look to Eugene Peterson, one man, one pastor serving a relatively small church in a world of megachurches. He bore witness to another way of doing things that, by its truthfulness, can cut through the noise of the age, endure passing fads, and inspire countless others to think differently about what it means to be Christian, to be a pastor, be the church. By telling his story and countless other stories, he introduced something new into the flow of history, meaning that he was also a storyteller. He didn't just live in anonymity within his church, but he actually did some of the work of storytelling that impacts and influences our culture to this day and will, as you said, will probably outlive us. And so then what is that dynamic between actually engaging in culture making and storytelling and actually making this impact in the world, but actually then remaining small and local? And how does that actually function and work?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two different answers to that question. There's an answer that applies to like Christians that are artists and feel called to the world. And there's an answer that I mean that chapter talks a bunch about professional wrestling for
Yeah,
a variety
I
of
love
reasons. You know, yeah, I was gonna say in ways that like some people are like, what on earth or why are we talking so much about professional wrestling in this chapter? But I think there's a contrast, and I think on the one hand, like for pastors, I think a lot of pastors have kind of lost their way. They've become so familiar with this milieu in which it's like, oh, you're a pastor, so clearly you have like a big online presence and a podcast, and you have these different things from which you're sort of broadcasting these big ideas. I think Peterson marks the way in the sense that like that didn't interest him until he was much later in life and had kind of earned his stripes, done his work, and was ready for his Bible translations to kind of lead the way into other commentary and all that. The flip side of it, though, is that like there's a lot of Christians that are sitting in pews and are trying to figure out like, okay, what do I do as a cultural storyteller? And that's not just like, I mean, it definitely includes, but it's not just like Christian filmmakers, storytellers, writers, you know, that sort of thing. But it's also like Christians who are in positions of influence as politicians or academics or institutional leaders or whatever. Like all of those people are storytellers in one form or another. And they've got to figure out like, how do I bear witness in the position God has put me in? I think there's something corrupting for people in those positions, on the one hand, that tempts them to sort of become grandiose. And like, I made a whole podcast about what that looks like, right? But I think there's also a temptation on the flip side of it that tempts them to go, I mean, it's almost like, I don't know, maybe the best metaphor for it is like to hide their light under a bushel, right? And say, yeah, God's put me in this position. I'm the head of my department at this big university, or I'm a partner at a legal firm, or I'm a principal at a high school or whatever. But I'm going to sit in this position and not talk about my faith, or certainly not express that my faith informs how I do what I do. That's very tempting. That's very comfortable. It's especially comfortable for Christians who are made uncomfortable by kind of the political, social, cultural environment that's emerged with the candidacy of Trump.
Mike, your book, The Church in Dark Times, is an incredible exploration of what ideologies do and the framework of Hannah Arendt, and then some of the practices for us to resist. I want to end with this quote, and then there's a couple questions I like to ask at the end. And I really encourage everybody to go out and get the book, to read it. It's a fantastic read. Highly recommend it. You say we need something better and more beautiful than what ideology offers. This is true not only because ideology creates the conditions for abuse and destruction, but more fundamentally because it cannot satisfy our deepest human needs. The cry of the soul is not to be a fully engaged member of the local church. It's not to be a real man or real woman in a real marriage. It's not to use our spiritual gifts, find our calling, master this or that method of discipleship, or successfully become a multiplying Christian. Rather, the cry of the soul is to come home to God. And I say amen to that. And I pray that many would come home to God, that we as churches, believers, would foster a place of community, and a place of worship and a place of transcendence so that we can come home to God. And so I thought that was a beautiful way. And so, Mike, just a couple of quick questions I'd like to ask at the end. One, if you go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
Oh, man. Okay, this sounds like I'm equivocating or being weird, but like I genuinely believe this. Like I would give no advice to my 21-year-old self. I just genuinely don't know that. Like I don't know that I could tell that person anything that would change how they did what came that or approached what followed. And I'm also like I look at my own life, and even with the suffering, I'm just like I needed all of that. I needed all of those mistakes, all of them, everyone.
Yeah, that's good. Anything you've been reading or watching lately you could recommend?
Let's see. I just started watching Shrinking, the Jason Segel, Harrison Ford show, and it's kind of blowing my mind. And then, I just feel like Apple TV is doing great stuff. I just finished Bad Monkey. It's definitely like, viewer beware in terms of content warnings and all that. But I grew up in Miami and South Florida, and so there's like a little bit of like a nostalgia piece there. I love that show.
Yeah, it's also great to see Vince Vaughn doing some stuff again, doing his shtick. That he loves.
Yeah,
Vince Vaughn.
It's like classic Vince Vaughn. Sure. So I love it.
Great. Well, Mike, how can people get The Church in Dark Times, and where else would you like to point people to?
Readers interested in the book, they can find it at basically anywhere books are sold, and Amazon, Barnes & Noble. If you can go probably directly through the publisher at Brazos. I'm findable. I'm at Twitter and Instagram and all of that, and pretty easy to locate at all those places.
Mike, thank you for this conversation. Really enjoyed going deep into the ideologies, banality of evil, of what it takes to actually follow somebody that tells a story that tries to make sense of the world. Thank you for going into some practices that could help us resist this evil, as solitude and thinking, storytelling, and culture making, worship, examples like Eugene Peterson. It was a fantastic conversation. Really enjoyed it. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you want to see more episodes like this, go to patreon.com/shiftingculture and become a monthly patron of the show. You can help us produce more episodes so that we can see the body of Christ look more like Jesus. If you become a patron on patreon.com/shiftingculture, you will get early access to episodes. You will get episode guides. You will get bonus shows, hopefully, and more. So go to patreon.com/shiftingculture and become a monthly patron. Also, leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps us out and helps us find new listeners to the show. And just go and share this podcast with your friends, your family, your network, people that you think would enjoy it as well. Thank you again for listening to the show. I hope you have a great week.